Well, hey there, everybody. I want to come back to our best school year ever. Yesterday we read chapter 2, and it was mostly about some of the antics of the Herdman family, how they managed to get themselves in trouble just about everywhere they went. So today we'll move on to chapter 3 and see what's going on here as we continue to make our way through this, what appears to be very funny book. Naturally, my mother wasn't too crazy about the Herdmans since they were always mopping up the floor with Charlie, but she had too much to do, she said, to spend time complaining about them. She would leave that to Alice Wendleken's mother, who was so good at it. Mrs. Wendleken complained about them all the time, to everybody. It was her second favorite subject, besides how smart Alice was, and how pretty and how talented, and how it would all go to waste if Gladys Herdman bit her to death. Every time you turned around, Mrs. Wendleken was volunteering Alice to be the star of something, the main fairy, or the head elf, or the clean up our streets poster girl. And when the Chamber of Commerce bought a respirator for the hospital, they put a picture of it in the paper, and sure enough, there was Alice hooked up to the respirator. Mrs. Wendleken said she didn't have anything to do with that. The photographer just looked around and said, "I wonder if that pretty girl would be willing to pose with the respirator." But nobody believed her. Alice didn't get any applause for this either, but she carried the picture around anyway and showed it to anyone who would hold still. She showed it to Imogene Herdman at the recess, and Imogene took one look and hollered, "Get away from me. Don't touch me. Whatever you got, I don't want it," which brought the school nurse in a hurry in case Al had small pox or something. It emptied the playground in a hurry, too. Everybody figured that if it was something Imogene Herdman was scared to catch, it would wipe out the rest of us because ordinary germs didn't even slow the Herdmans down. They never got mumps or pink eye or colds or stomach aches or anything. A snake once bit Leroy Herdman, and Leroy's leg swelled up a little bit, but that was about all. The snake died. Leroy brought it to school and tied it all up and down the light cord in the teacher's supply closet, and about 5 minutes later, the kindergarten teacher, Miss Newman, came in and pulled the cord. She had all the day's helpers with her, 6 kindergarten kids carrying pots of red finger paint. When Miss Newman screamed, they all dropped their pots, and finger paint flew all over the place. Then somebody upset 2 big boxes of chalk, and they all tramped around in that. And when a janitor heard the racket and opened the door, he just took one look and went straight to get the principal. He said there had been some terrible accident, and the supply closet was full of bloody people, apparently all cut up and screaming in pain. By the time the principal got there, Miss Newman had pulled herself together and was herding the little kids down the hall to the washroom, and then the recess bell rang. So the hall was full of kids and teachers calling to Miss Newman. "What happened? What happened?" And the principal telling everyone to move along, move right along, nothing here to see. Of course, there was plenty to see. The whole thing looked like a big disaster we had just read about in history called the Children's Massacre. In all the commotion, Leroy Herdman just walked into the supply closet, untied his snake, put it in his pocket, and walked out again. When we got back from recess, the principal and Miss Newman and a janitor and a boys' basketball coach were all crawling around the floor of the supply closet, and Miss Newman was saying, "I tell you, there was a snake crawling up the light cord." Of course, they never did find it because nobody looked in Leroy's pocket. I couldn't understand why the snake died and Leroy didn't, But when I asked my father, he said that Leroy probably stretched the story. A snake bit him, my father said, and then he found a different snake that was already dead. That's what I think. My mother said she bet it wasn't a snake at all, that Leroy just tied a whole lot of poor worms together. But I decided that Leroy was telling the truth for the first time in his life, that the snake was perfectly healthy, bit Leroy, and immediately died. So maybe Mrs. Wendleken wasn't far wrong to pour iodine all over Alice. Maybe Alice should shut up about this treatment and just be glad she wasn't dead like the snake. 2 or 3 days later, Leroy, he stuck the snake in the third grade pencil sharpener, tail first, and that teacher went all to pieces too. It was bad enough, she said, to find a snake in the pencil sharpener, but when she almost sharpened it by mistake, the snake was pretty worn out by then, so they threw it away. But nobody in the third grade would go near the pencil sharpener for the rest of the week. My mother's friend, Miss Phillips, worked for the welfare department, and one of her jobs was to check up on the herdmans. So Mother told her about the snake bite in case Leroy should get some kind of shot for it. But Miss Phillips just said she didn't know of any shot that would benefit Leroy, and anyway, all her sympathies were with the snake. I went once to the garage where those kids lived, she said. But I never got inside, and I barely got out of the yard alive. It was full of rocks and poison ivy and torn up bicycles and pieces of cars and great big holes they'd dug. I fell in one of the holes, and the cat jumped on me out of the window. Good thing I had a hat on, or I'd be bald. Now I just drive past the place once a month, and if they haven't managed to blow it up or burn it down, I figure they're all right. But a snake bite, Mother said. Don't you think it's unusual? I certainly do, Miss Phillips said. It's the first time something bit one of them instead of the other way around. The whole thing got into the newspaper. Reptile found in Woodrow Wilson's school, the article said. Teachers and students alarmed. They probably meant Miss Newman and all the kindergarten kids. Parents seek action. Probably meant Miss Wendleken seeking to get the herdmans expelled or arrested or something. School official inspects the premises. Was Mr. Crabtree, the principal, who stuck his head in the third grade room and said that if one more snake showed up anywhere, he'd personally kill it, skin it, cook it, and feed it to whoever it was responsible. I don't know whether that would have scared Leroy or not, but it didn't matter anyway because he wasn't there. Imogene said he stayed home to bury the snake. She had this messy scribbled up note that said, Leroy is absent at a funeral. I'm sorry to hear that, Imogene, the teacher said. Was it a member of your family? Why aren't you at the funeral? It was a friend of Leroy's, Imogene said. I didn't like him. Miss Wendleken was mad because the newspaper article didn't say it was Leroy Herdman's snake that caused all this trouble. And she was mad at the principal because he wouldn't say so either. I can't prove who the snake belonged to, Mr. Crabtree said. And even if I could, why would I? I want a boa constrictor, you know, and it was dead to begin with. But I guess Miss Wendleken was really out to nail Leroy, and she wouldn't give up. Of course it was Leroy's snake. Everybody knows it was Leroy's snake. Why else would he bury it? Why would Leroy Herdman bury someone else's snake? I don't know, Mr. Crabtree was fed up with the snake and Leroy Herdman and Miss Wendleken too, but if he did bury a snake for somebody else, it was the first cooperative thing he'd ever done in his life. And I just think we ought to drop the whole subject, don't you? That would probably have been the end of it, except that Miss Wendleken described this conversation to my mother, who described it to Miss Phillips. Then Miss Phillips went to school and told Mr. Crabtree that she had a plan to civilize the herdmans, or at least one of them. It's about the snake, she began, but Mr. Crabtree wouldn't let her say any more. I'll do it, he said. I don't even care what it is you want, just so I don't have to hear any more about the snake. So Leroy got named Good School Citizen of the Month for an act of kindness. The award read, of course, this was one of the big surprises to everybody, especially Leroy, and it nearly killed Alice Wendleken, who had piled up more good deeds and good grades and extra credit project and perfect attendance records than anybody else in the whole history of the Woodrow Wilson School, and expected to be the Good School Citizen of the Month for the rest of her life. Nobody could figure out what kind of thing Leroy had done, but Miss Phillip told my mother. He buried a snake, Mother said. That's it? That's it, Miss Phillips said. Well, I guess if you were the snake, you might call it an act of kindness. But I don't understand. I just thought he might decide to live up to the honor, Miss Phillips explained. He might be a changed person. Mother said she wouldn't count on it. He probably doesn't even know what it was that he did. He didn't even do it, Charlie told her. Imogene just said he did. Nobody buried the snake. The janitor threw it in the trash masher. I saw him. Well, don't tell anyone, Mother said. Miss Wendleken would never shut up about it. Mother was right about Leroy. He didn't know what he did or how he got to be the good school citizen. And when Charlie wouldn't tell him, he buried Charlie up to his neck in a trash masher barrel, which would have been tough on Charlie if the janitor didn't happen to see him before he mashed up the trash. So Leroy wasn't a changed person, unless you want to count that he only buried Charlie up to his neck instead of all the way. Well, that ends chapter 3. We learn a little bit more about the Herdmans and their mischief behavior. We see that Miss Wendleken is a real strong advocate to get these herdmans, but we'll see what happens in chapter 4. That's our reading for today. For those of you that are following along on this story, it's I don't know, I can't imagine being in a school where we had the herdmans, but at any rate, y'all take care of yourselves and stay safe. Be kind to people.